This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship,
about engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues
and how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. As many of our listeners know, in the last week, the new census data has been released, at least in part, by the U.S. government. And this is data reflecting the once every 10 years counting of American citizens. This is required in the U.S. Constitution. It's one of the things that we do like clockwork. And the census this year has revealed some extraordinary changes in American society. We are fortunate to be joined today by someone who is writing some of the most interesting analysis of this material, someone who's really looking at what the census tells us about how our society is changing. This is my colleague and friend, Stephen Pedigo. Stephen is a professor of practice at the LBJ School at the University of Texas at Austin and the inaugural director of our really cool Urban Lab. And I'm sure some of the cool stuff they're doing will come up in our conversation. Stephen has advised more than 50 cities and regions across the world. I was looking through on his website some of the really cool projects he's been involved in, all kinds of things related to transportation, urban planning, really, really cool stuff. His real specialty is helping urban environments learn to be more creative, innovative, and particularly inclusive communities. It's going to be really interesting to hear what Stephen has to say about the census for us today. Stephen, thank you for joining us.
Jeremy, thanks for having me. I'm excited to geek out with you guys about numbers.
That's what we like to do, geek out on the numbers and understand historical change. Before we turn to our conversation with Stephen, of course, we have Mr. Zachary's poem for today. We're excited to hear what you've come up with.
If you could zoom in on the map and see the refugee who traces poems at night, the family that sits under a tree, a purple mountain majesty of sights. If only you could hear their ageless sigh, if you could see the face that is the spot, if you could only look them in the eye, up close the orange mark, the census dot. If you could make a perfect photograph from this, the heap of our uncaring hate, if you could find a piercing epitaph in these, the hopes, the visions told to wait, it would be worth it all, the endless quest, for you to find a vision not oppressed.
It is a true sonnet. Wow. What is your poem about?
My poem is really about the ways in which the American city is defined by inequality and by racial oppression, and the ways in which the census count reflects that. And how this data can seem really abstract, but what we're really talking about is a singular person or a group of people and their experience and the oppression that they faced.
Right. Wow. Well, and I'm sure many of these themes will come up. Stephen, to give us some background for understanding some of these themes that Zachary raises, what really struck you as new and different in this census as compared to other censuses that we've had before?
Yeah, sure. So let's just talk. I think we'll start with maybe four kind of headlines that really jumped out at me, right? First, I think is obviously the U.S. is growing, but we're growing a lot slower than we've grown in the past, right? So we went from about 331 million Americans. We're at 331 million Americans from about 308. That's about a 7% increase. It is the second smallest increase that we've seen in terms of the U.S. Census only since after the Great Depression. So we're growing a lot slower. I think that to me is quite striking. I think if you look at where the growth is happening across the country, we see the continued decline of the Rust Belt and the boom of the Sun Belt. And the census really sort of speaks to that now, right? You've got nearly 7 in 10 people in the U.S. now living in the Sun Belt. And when I call the Sun Belt, I'm sort of thinking the Mountain West, Texas, Arizona, Florida, right? So you've got the Sun Belt really rising up. And that's going to play out, obviously, as we talk about congressional redistricting, things to that affair. Thirdly, I think what's interesting to me is how much more diverse we've become as a country. And I think this speaks to Zachary's poem, but it also speaks to, I think a lot of the challenges that we have are facing in the next few years about how we grow more equitable cities and communities and metros, but we're way more diverse. White population has declined across the country. BIPOC populations have grown. In fact, I think one of the most striking headline out of the census for me was out of the Texas data, and that is that if you look at the number of new Texans, about 95% of all new Texans, and there's a lot of us, there's about 1,000 of us new every day, are people of color. And so that's going to have significant ramifications, I think, about the way we build more inclusive economies going forward. And Zachary's right in his poem. I mean, I use this data all the time to drive strategic work for cities and counties and regions. And so it's going to be interesting about how we marry strategy with some of this data.
So Stephen, just building on these excellent points about diversity, about slower growth, about the shifting nature of the U.S. population, in a sense, from northern Rust Belt, Midwestern Rust Belt to the Sun Belt, as you put it. Is it also indicative that we've become a more urban society? Is that a fair reading of this?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the data, I mean, across the U.S., it is most of the growth happen in urban areas. And in fact, now I think if you look across the U.S., I was looking at this earlier, I think about 87% of the U.S. population now lives in a metropolitan environment. I'm kind of a geek about Texas data. I think you know that, Jeremy. And one of the things that's really striking to me, just to put a pin in that for you, is that prior to the U.S. Census, about 87% of Texans lived in metropolitan areas. Now, again, it's almost 90 to 91% of all Texans live in metro areas. And the other thing that's interesting is that if we look at Texas again, if we talk about what we call the Texas Triangle, and I'm talking, for folks that are listening that aren't familiar with that, it's the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area down to Houston, over to San Antonio, and up in Austin. It kind of forms this triangle. What's interesting about that is that nearly 70% of all Texans now live in that triangle. And if you look at all the data of people that have moved, right, we are the sort of the booming state, us in Utah, Arizona, and Florida. 9 in 10 Texans moved to the metropolitan areas of Austin, Dallas, and San Antonio, and Houston. And so we are absolutely more urban. And if you look at the data across the country about rural communities, significant decline in rural communities, not just in the Rust Belt, but also in places that you would expect, places that are booming here in Texas, for instance, or even out west, and some of the Western mountain states have seen significant declines in their rural communities as well.
Why do you think that is? I mean, we've long been a society that's had both rural and urban communities. Obviously, in the 19th century, we were a predominantly rural society. But the 20th century is really a century of mixed rural-urban living. Why do you think we're going so heavily in the urban and more diverse direction?
Jane Jacobs 101, the great urbanist, right? That is the idea of sharing of ideas, and that is that we're now a knowledge-based economy. And so knowledge-based economies requires people and you and I to come together to share ideas, to formulate new thinking. And innovation is very much driven about proximity. And so the idea of just the makeup of the industrial-based economy, moving from industrial-based economy to a knowledge-based economy, or what my colleague Rich Florida would call a creative-based economy, has required us to come together, a cluster, to create these nodes of innovation, and particularly around institutions, right? Healthcare institutions, universities, science, innovation centers, and those types of things. And much of that is being, frankly, driven by having to be in close proximity, and that's happening in metropolitan areas, frankly.
The data obviously shows that, and you've been predicting this for a long time, along with Richard Florida and many of the other real leading thinkers in the field that you're a part of. But it does seem counterintuitive in a moment when we're living through COVID, when people aren't going into their offices in the same way they did before, when we're communicating in the way, for instance, we're recording this podcast right over the web, place seems to be less important in some ways, but you're saying that the data shows that it's actually becoming more important. How do we understand
Yeah, I
that?
actually think that place is going to be, I think that one of the things that could come out of this is that, so I think the way that we think about place and the use of place is that for a lot of our mundane type of work that we do, right, for stuff where we need to sort of maybe have independent time and thinking and writing and a lot of those types of things, that stuff can obviously will happen at home or it can happen remotely, right? But the real exchange of ideas, right, where we see the friction of ideas together, the friction of innovation together, requires people to come together. And so, I don't think that this is the depth of distance or the depth of place. In fact, I think that what we start to see is a greater emphasis, particularly in high-driven innovation sectors, where people come together more. Maybe don't come together as frequently, but come together more with much more purposeful time together. And so, I think that we will probably spend less time in the office, but more intentional time together. And in fact, that may actually play pretty well for us in terms of the innovation piece. I think one of the things that's interesting is that a lot of folks have said remote work actually save rural communities? Well, the reality is that without having access to the type of infrastructure that's needed to support remote work, right? Many of these rural communities will never really sort of be able to sort of take advantage of it. That's one of the reasons that infrastructure development continues to be such an important piece of this conversation. But at the end of the day, right? I mean, I think what's always interesting about the data, particularly one of the things I love about census data, and particularly as you start to dive into census data, looking at the types of communities that form, by immigrant communities or racial communities or LBGTQ communities or any of those types of things. What's interesting is that people cluster together. There's a likeness, a community creation. And so that's the same thing that happens on the knowledge, that very much same thing happens on knowledge-based side, right? One of the things that that's come out of a lot of the work that I've done in terms of advising cities about innovation ecosystems and innovation districts and blah, 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 blah. As much as mayors and officials think it's all about the beautiful buildings and the real estate, really it's not. It's about how do you bring people together. And I think that's one of the things that cities has done for a really long time, and why we see the rise of the urban economies is that it's about people coming together. The other additional point, not to rattle on this, is a lot of folks will say, if you look at the metropolitan economies of growth, yeah, it's metros that are growing, but it's all growing on the peripheral. A little bit, that is somewhat true, and that's somewhat false. In fact, some of our urban core areas, surprisingly, the one that I think is the poster child for urban growth has been the rise of New York City. New York City was expected to see a significant decline in this U.S. Census, and in fact, it added a substantial amount of residents. It's almost 9 million residents. Now, same here when we look at in Texas, many of our urban economies, particularly our urban counties, Travis County, for instance, Dallas County, the inner urban core of Harris County, we've seen significant population increases that have kind of, frankly, been a bit dwarfed by some of the suburban growth, but also continues to be pretty strong.
So I think it's clear then that cities and America as a whole have become more diverse, but have American cities and American communities at large become more integrated?
So that's a really interesting question, right? I think once we're able to get the data and really dive into the data and look at the way the neighborhood the conformations of neighborhoods or the makeup of neighborhoods, I think that's a question to ask and that we'll be able to answer. The data just hasn't been released at that granular of a level yet for us to be able to do that analysis, but there will be in the coming year, absolutely an interesting look at that for sure. I mean, generally speaking, I think what we know, right, is that we actually probably aren't becoming more integrated. In fact, we continue to probably become more segregated. That's been what some of the trends have looked at. If you follow the trends over the past few years using the ACS data, the American Community Survey data, is that in fact we've actually become more segregated. The question is, will we be able to confirm that when we look at the U.S. Census? I think that probably will be the case.
It does seem, Stephen, that, for instance, taking a city like Austin, the inner core, which we used to call the inner city, right, in negative terms 20, 30 years ago, right, has now become the cool part of the city. And from what I saw in the data, has become whiter. And then the outer core has become whiter, and then a lot of places in between have become more diverse. Is that a pattern you're seeing across cities?
That's totally true. It's the remaking it's the remaking of cities and the remaking of suburban areas. Before I went to NYU, I spent many years at the Initiative for Competitive Inner City, looking at distressed urban communities, and particularly for a long time we were focusing on the urban core. This was Mike Porter's group out of Boston. But one of the things that we noticed over time, and this was about 2010 when the 2010 census was released, is that in fact, if we really want to understand the diversity of America's cities and really understand some of the challenges that are facing, particularly when we look at distressed areas, in fact, it wasn't really as much about the urban core, particularly, Jeremy. It was these sort of old streetcar-like suburbs, or those inner suburbs that are just outside of the urban belt, right? So not the exurbs, but the sort of the inner suburban ring. In fact, that continues to be the case, where we've seen a much more diversification of those suburbs. We've obviously, much of the work that's been written from the folks at the Brookings Institute has looked at the suburbanization of poverty and has said really what's happened is that we've actually seen a lot of that happening. That in fact those suburbs are becoming much more diverse, but we're also seeing frankly, our urban cores become these sort of, in a sense, almost gated-like communities. And I think that's a lot of what the challenge of how we have to think about city building going forward is: how do you pull those gates down, so to speak?
Right. These are neighborhoods that are near prospering neighborhoods, but seem left behind time and again, maybe because the highway has cut them off.
The highway's cut them off, or there's been terrible land use planning, right? So where there's just a need to just go back and reimagine land use planning, right? I mean, that's one of the things that's so important to understand the census, and gets back to the poem a bit that was given, is that as you think about census data are numbers and peoples. And a lot of that is driven by economic policy, but a lot of it is also just driven, frankly, by the way that we as cities and communities and metros have thought about land use policy as well. And so I think one of the things that we're starting to see as we become maybe a bit more knowledge-based driven is that even, in fact, we maybe see some loosening around our land use codes, where we see much more mixes of uses. And so rather than having sort of strictly, the not so great uses in distressed urban areas, what we may be able to do is, because of technology and the lighter types of the different types of industries in our communities, we actually may see some of that go away. So maybe that it gives us an opportunity to think about how we can reimagine land use planning as well.
But how do you do that while also making sure to account for gentrification, to prevent diverse communities from being kicked out of their homes or overpriced, priced out of their homes because of rising demand? How do you develop in a way that allows for affordability and allows communities to stay where they are?
If that's the $1 million question, and if I knew the answer, I probably wouldn't be teaching at the LBJ school. But I think it's a really important one. Yeah. I mean, so that's the really challenging question, because at the end of the day, all of our housing policy has been it's sort of reactive, not sort of proactive, right? I think there's a lot of solutions that have to happen there. One, thinking through better engagement of the use of tools that we're seeing across the country, such as community land banks and community trusts, as a way to think about addressing some of the affordability issues, getting your private sector and incentivizing the private sector, not to build more affordable housing. The other thing I would say, in a place like Austin, Texas, which is a fast-growing metropolitan area, we grew about 33%. We're one of the fastest growing in the country. What's interesting about our city is that we're just not even building enough market rate housing, right? So that just exacerbates the affordable housing issues. And so I think, if we're talking about gentrification, for me, one, it's about housing policy, that's for sure, and thinking about both market rate and affordable housing and the mix of that. Two, using some of the tools that are really that are sort of new and innovative, community land trusts and community land banks and land corporations and stuff. That all is new policy arenas for many, many cities. Particularly had been much done in the northeastern part of the United States, some in California, but now we're starting to see more newer cities like ours and across others, Denver, Seattle, and others started to use those. So I think using some more of those types of tools. But the other thing I think that our housing friends forget is that also I think we have to ensure that not only are we dealing with if we want to challenge the gentrification issue, We want to do it from the housing perspective. We want to ensure that we're thinking about land use. We've got some policies in place that allow us maybe to think about how we cap some of the property taxes or things to that affair, but also just thinking about our economic development issues as well. Making sure that we're investing in the skills of residents, getting them the skills that they can needed to participate into this knowledge-based economy, ensuring that they've got the right type of training, ensuring that their kids have access to do that type of stuff. And so, dealing with gentrification, it's a fast-moving train, but and so it requires some short-term policies, but it also calls some really long-term policies as well. And it's not just about doing on the housing side and the land use side; it's also about that economic development piece as well, I think.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And of course, at the root of all this is money, capital. What did we learn from the census so far? Obviously, there's more data to be released, but what did we learn from the data you've seen so far, Stephen, about income distributions in the U.S.? Have they changed? What can we say about them?
Yeah, I think they're again, I think that they like themselves are kind of following a little bit like the Sun Belt, right? We've seen some some spikes, obviously, in the Sun Belt. I think some of our metro area, within the metro areas, I think in terms of income distribution, Jeremy, you hit it at the beginning, and that is that the urban core or the central city areas have seen significant increase in income, where we've seen the decline of that in our suburban areas, right? So again, it kind of plays out onto the same thing of this quote unquote gated city. And I think that's going to be for me, that's that real challenge going forward, is that as we think about urban policy, and particularly, and I hate using the word urban, because in fact, what we should be actually be thinking about is metropolitan policy, right? Metropolitan policy is probably the right word to be doing, and that's getting incentivizing cities and counties to work together to deal with these issues. So, one of the best metropolitan areas that's always been able to sort of really tackle these metropolitan issues has really always been the New York metropolitan area, and that's because they sort of think about themselves as a metropolitan area, not just as a city. Here in Texas, for instance, dealing with the challenges of our income distribution, it's a game of chicken a lot of times with our cities and our counties in terms of fighting for incentives or fighting for investment and those types of things. And so we're not thinking growing, or we're not thinking about our economic development policy in a metropolitan sense. We're not thinking about our land use policy in a metropolitan sense, nor are we even thinking about transportation. Again, just continue to exacerbate those issues, right? Putting up the gate around the urban core higher and higher and higher.
I think you touched on, to me, what is the most striking insight so far from the census, which is the degree to which our institutions, especially our institutions that make political choices and policy, are out of touch with these demographic changes. And I think that's part of the explanation for Texas, right?
Yeah,
where so much.
I'm sorry, Jeremy. This is the thing that pisses me the most off about being a Texan, a born-again Texan, I guess, is that, and I actually have a little piece that's going to be in the Texas Monthly, that's going to run Texas Monthly about this. Is that in a state like Texas, where we've got 29 million residents, you've got 26 metropolitan areas, and those metropolitan areas are as diverse as the gateway cities of Houston and Dallas, to the tech city of Austin, Texas, which has runaway gentrification and affordability issues we're having to deal with, to climate change on the Gulf Coast, to the decline of alternative energy, the decline of traditional energy in Midland and Odessa and places like Beaumont, is that our state policy leaders don't understand the diversification of those metropolitan areas, that a one-size-fits-all policy doesn't work, right? And so our cities and counties, our city councils, for instance, for sure, are the direct line to the people, right? They're the direct line. The great Ben Barber said that if mayors ruled the world, they tend to be the most accountable. And so while we've got these fast-growing, diverse areas across Texas and adding lots of residents, we have this top-down. We've now embraced, from a state level here in Texas, just this abrasive top-down policy that just doesn't work for a state that is as diverse as we are. With these many a set of metros are growing and facing many, many different types of challenges. It just doesn't work. It won't work.
And do you see this as far worse than it was with the last census?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I mean, in the state of Texas, I would say yes. I mean, at least you had some rationalization, not rationalization, some rational leadership, maybe in the state house. I'm probably going to get fired saying that, but yeah, and you had
you're accurate.
You had rational
You're
leaders at the
accurate.
state house, right? Even though you're a Republican-controlled house, and love or hate Rick Perry, he at least understood diversification. He understood the market and what was happening here. I think what we have now is just this, essentially, it's almost like our legislature is tying the hands behind the backs of our city and county leaders and expecting them to solve the problems, and that just doesn't work.
Or is it also, and this just builds on what you said, Stephen, is it somewhat that there's a powerful population of rural-based, or at least those who identify with a rural imagery of white citizens and white voters who feel they're losing control of the country and are trying to just hold on to things as long as they can? It's a simple explanation.
I think it's a simple explanation. Yeah. I think it could be somewhat true, and I think we're going to see it's going to play out in. We're about to see how it plays out in the state of Texas for sure, right? Particularly when we come to redistricting. I think that the fight around redistricting in Texas is going to be an interesting case study to watch. It is going to be very, very challenging for a sort of rural Republican-driven legislature to gerrymander a state that is now 9 in 10 metropolitan urban, and where nearly 95% of all the growth has been people of color in our metro areas. That's going to be a real challenge, I think. Right. And I think it's incumbent. So last thing I would say about that, it's incumbent upon people like us, right, that are policy folks, to keep beating the drum that we are metro, that we are urban, and that we are a community that's not extreme, that is not all white guys that look like me, but we are made up of a diverse community of Black and brown residents and fellow neighbors, and we so that's going to be, I think, really critical in terms of ensuring that our communities are representative in a way that makes sense going forward.
Right. It seems to me that one of the real positive takeaways from the census, and we always look for positive historical lessons on the podcast, is that despite a lot of the intolerant rhetoric we hear in our society, we really are growing more diverse, and we are becoming a society that really embraces many, many more lifestyles. How do you think we can best get that message out? Is it telling the metropolitan story? What else should we be saying so that we can recognize what's really happening, not what people are telling us?
Yeah, I think the census data for me, particularly if you're a Texan and a person that studies Texas cities and a person that loves metro areas, it is a story to be cheerleading, right? It's a story where you're adding 1,000 new Texans a day, nearly 1,100 new Texans a day. 95% of them are people of color, and they're very educated as well. I think the data is going to show that they're going to be much more educated. They're much more urban. So for me, that's absolutely fantastic. And in fact, if you look, the other thing I would say about this is that if you look across the Texas metros, right, and not to make this the Texas show, but it's what I know. If you look at the Texas metros, and there are 26 of them, all 26 except for one grew, was on the positive side of was in the positive side of in terms of population gain. Only Wichita Falls is the only metropolitan area in Texas that declined. And so, if we are thinking about communicating a message about metropolitanism and diversity, Texas becomes the poster child for that. We are, again, much more diverse. Our Hispanic population now is nearly 40% of our residents. It is a place that has strong LGBTQ communities as well. And so, I think that there's a lot of good to be told out of the census. And frankly, I think it's also just a great story for economic development. I always come back to, what's the story and how does it come back to strategy for cities? What we know now is that our students, Jeremy, want to work in more diverse communities. Our students want to live and work and have access and do work in those communities. We know that corporations are wanting to hire more diverse workers. And so for me, as a Texas economic development story, this is great. We're kind of the front. We are really the front or the face of what frankly, America's going to look like and will look like in the future.
It's so true, and you say it so well, Stephen. It's, on the one hand, what you see coming out of a lot of the politics in Texas looks retrograde and reactionary, but yet the state itself is the leading edge of all kinds of extraordinary positive changes in terms of diversity and in terms of new lifestyles and creativity.
The last thing I would say is that, and I love telling. What people ask me, why did you come back to LBJ school? Why did you come back to Texas? You were living in New York. And I said, well, if you really want to understand what the future of cities are going to be like, it's going to happen here in the U.S. It's going to happen here in Texas, just because of all those things that we're talking about. If you want to understand how a 15-minute city is going to be built and what that looks like, that's happening in Texas. We've been doing 15-minute communities for many, many years. If you want to understand cities that are going to build brand new transportation systems and what that looks like in terms of displacement and how we manage gentrification, that's going to be done here in a place like Austin, Texas. If you want to be able to think about communities that are going to be extremely global and international, that's Houston, that's San Antonio, the birthplace of public-private partnerships, Dallas, Fort Worth, and so a lot of. If you're really interested in metropolitan cities and it's metropolitan and urban policy, this is a great place to do it because this really is the future, I think.
Very well said. And you predicted, in your move, you predicted where things were going. Zachary, as a young person who, sometimes can face a lot of negative news out there, right? There's so much. This is,
Certainly, yeah.
We see the collapse of a 20-year investment in Afghanistan at the same time that the census comes out. Do you see a positive story here? Do you see hope in this? And do you think other young people will see hope in the census?
I think so. I think that in many ways, multiculturalism has become the norm in these very metropolitan environments, perhaps not outside of them, and especially in my generation. And I think that the continued sort of movement of people within our country and just the bare facts of which populations are growing and which aren't mean that's going to continue to be our reality for a very long time.
Right. I think that's very well said. I think this set. Stephen, last question for us to close on. What do you think is the most interesting thing that hasn't come out yet in terms of the data that you would suggest our listeners look for in coming weeks and months from your analysis and others?
Yeah, look, I think I'm always interested to see what's going to happen with, looking at immigrant data. I think that's always really interesting to me. I'm really interested to look about how asking the questions are, where are skilled residents moving, in terms of the educated class? Do we really see them happening in urban areas? Are they happening in other places that we don't think? So I think some of that's going to be quite interesting to look at. I think asking the question and looking about how people are commuting and are we seeing the rise of different types of modality in terms of the way that we're commuting, particularly those points I think will be quite interesting. I don't know. I'm just a geek about this stuff. I love this stuff. I think it's fascinating to me. This is kind of, it's interesting. I was on holiday last week and I was up in the middle of the night looking at census data numbers, and my husband's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "This is like Christmas for someone like me, right?" So,
it's an archive of historical change. I mean, it gives us a snapshot of over a 10-year period how our society has changed. We're fortunate, Stephen, to have people of your knowledge and experience analyzing this and helping us make sense of it. Thank you for joining us today, Stephen, and sharing your insights.
Thanks for the questions. It was great to be with you guys.
And Zachary, thank you, as always, for your poem and your insights. And thank you most of all to our loyal listeners. Thank you for joining us for this week of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Herrera Codini.
Stay tuned for a new episode every week. You can find This Is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher.
See you next time.